Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking the vast and frankly complex 200-year history of British imperialism in India. It's a wildly fascinating journey that traces a bizarre evolution from a simple, profit-seeking trading company to a massive, direct administrative state. The sheer scale of how this whole thing went down, along with the lasting scars and structures it left behind, well, they're absolutely crucial to understanding modern South Asia.
Okay, so here is our historical roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 5 key areas. Number 1, the corporate conquest. Number 2, 1857 and Crown Rule. 3, the dual colonial legacy. 4, the drain of wealth. And finally, number 5, the rise of Indian nationalism. Let's get into it.
Starting with Section 1, the corporate conquest, from merchants to masters.
You know, it's an absolutely incredible historical reality that the Indian subcontinent wasn't initially conquered by the British government at all. It was taken over by a corporation. I mean, imagine a modern multinational company essentially buying and fighting its way into becoming a sovereign nation. The British East India Company was founded back in 1600, and initially they just set up these strategic coastal trading posts in places like Surat and Madras. But then, by 1757, following Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey, this purely commercial entity morphed into a political heavyweight. Fast forward to 1765, and the Allahabad Treaty formally granted them the right to collect revenue in Bengal. And by 1848, they were actively swallowing up entire kingdoms using aggressive legal maneuvers.
To actually pull a feat like this off, the East India Company utilized military alliances, they took full advantage of regional fragmentation as the Mughal Empire started to weaken, and they deployed some very clever administrative tools. They basically transitioned from just extracting mercantile profits to outright controlling the political fabric of Bengal, and eventually the majority of the subcontinent.
So a primary mechanism for this insidious creeping control was something called the doctrine of lapse. Introduced by Lord Dalhousie, it allowed the British to simply annex princely states if a ruler died without a male heir. It was literally a paper weapon. And they used it to swallow up states like Awadh, Nagpur, and Jhansi, systematically stripping sovereignty from local rulers and replacing it right away with company control.
Which brings us to Section 2, 1857 and Crown Rule, the paradigm shift.
This aggressive corporate expansion, coupled with some really intense cultural insensitivity, finally hit a breaking point. The 1857 rebellion, widely known as the First War of Independence, didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was a pressure cooker, fueled by severe economic exploitation, the blatant land grabs from that doctrine of lapse we just talked about, and a deep disregard for local cultural sensitivities. The final spark? The introduction of the Royal Enfield rifle, whose greased cartridges deeply offended religious sentiments. This whole mix led to a massive uprising involving key figures like Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi and Bahadur Shah II.
Ultimately, the Great Rebellion proved one thing for sure. A commercial company could no longer administer these vast, volatile territories. So the East India Company's indirect, profit-driven corporate rule was completely scrapped in 1858. The company was effectively nationalized, birthing the British Raj. This was a whole new period of direct crown rule characterized by a viceroy, a uniform legal system, and a deeply centralized administration.
To manage this brand new Raj, the British relied heavily on the Indian civil service, which was famously dubbed the steel frame of the empire. Now, to their credit, they did shift from a privilege-based referral system to competitive exams in the mid-1800s. But, and this is a big but, the system remained deeply, intentionally elitist and largely inaccessible to actual Indians. That is, until figures like Satyendranath Tagore finally broke the barrier in 1864, becoming the very first Indian to clear the ICS exam.
Let's move on to Section 3, the dual colonial legacy, modernization versus exploitation.
Now we've reached the analytical heart of this era. It's a legacy defined by profound contradictions. We have to evaluate the introduction of what was supposed to be a modern infrastructure against the stark, harsh reality of immense economic drain and social interruption. It was this dual, simultaneous process of building up administrative structures while systematically extracting the region's wealth.
On one side of the ledger, yes, the British established these modern frameworks. We see extensive railway networks, the 1860 criminal code, a hierarchical court system, and Western-style education. But we really have to ask why. These frameworks weren't altruistic. They were primarily intended to streamline colonial administration, move raw materials efficiently to the ports, and create a loyal elite gentry, schooled in British Moors, to help them run the empire.
Section 4. The drain of wealth, deindustrialization, and laissez-faire.
The other side of that modernization ledger reveals how those exact same systems facilitated absolutely unprecedented economic extraction. The numbers on this deindustrialization are just staggering. British textile imports into India went from roughly 1 million yards in 1814 to over 2 billion yards by 1890. 2 billion! The British imposed strict free trade on India, flooding the market with cheap, factory-made goods from industrialized Britain, while other Western countries heavily protected their own markets. This severely shrank local Indian textile production down to just 25 to 45% of local consumption.
This systemic exploitation is perfectly captured by Dadabhai Naoroji's drain theory. It outlined how India's wealth was basically being funneled straight to Britain. India paid the major and minor expenses of the British Army, the costs of civil administration, even the pensions of British officials. As the theory argues, taxes on Indians were essentially paying for the infrastructure of their own subjugation, which completely prevented local capital formation.
Well, the darkest consequence of this strict laissez-faire economic policy occurred during the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878. British officials insisted the market should determine supply. Relief camps were technically opened, but as this chilling quote shows, the temple wage required starving people to perform hard labor for just 1,600 calories a day. That is far below subsistence levels. And anyone deemed too weak to work, they were simply turned away.
Millions starved to death. Estimates put it between 6 and 10 million deaths. And here's the kicker. It wasn't from an absolute lack of food on the subcontinent, but because rigid colonial market policies prioritized British trading reputations and completely unchecked wheat exports to Britain over Indian lives. The food was right there. The people just couldn't access it.
Finally, Section 5. Rise of Indian nationalism, the pressure cooker.
So, this brings us to what is basically the greatest historical irony of this entire era, this dual legacy. English education combined with severe economic exploitation accidentally created the very tools for the empire's demise. It was a classic societal boiling frog effect. Step by step, the joint stimuli of educational encouragement and the intense irritation of racial discrimination and wealth drain forged a unified, highly politically conscious middle class. They learned Western democratic ideals in British-style schools, then looked around and realized, hey, those exact ideals are being entirely denied to us in our own country.
This rising political consciousness directly catalyzed organized resistance. It shifted the narrative from fragmented regional uprisings into a massive, unified nationalist movement. They started challenging colonial authority right at its core, setting the stage for a highly coordinated freedom struggle. That final push began with early political organization, like the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885 and the Muslim League in 1906. Over time, this evolved into massive, sweeping campaigns like the Non-Cooperation and Quit India movements. All this relentless pressure ultimately culminated in the 1947 end of the Raj, finally granting India its independence, though, tragically, we know it was accompanied by a bloody partition based on religious lines.
When the British formally packed up and left, they left behind a profoundly transformed subcontinent. Modern India inherited a parliamentary system, a codified judiciary, the enduring steel frame of that civil service, deep, lasting economic scars from forced deindustrialization, and a complex cultural syncretism that touches everything from art to the English language itself.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought regarding the massive legacy we've unpacked today. By choosing to adapt, rather than completely replace these inherited colonial institutions, how did these systems continue to shape the realities of the world's largest democracy? Has it actually strengthened their justice system or simply maintained a framework that was originally designed for control? It's a heavy question, and it's one historians and citizens alike are still grappling with today. Thanks for joining me on This Explainer. We'll catch you next time.